Welcome to Chapter 10 as we're talking about simple experiments. So let's start with a study that was described in the Chronicle of Higher Education, asking about, do students self-center? And so this was a survey by the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And the survey and analytics company stoked fears that students were growing increasingly aware of what others would think. They surveyed nearly 20,000 college students and found that among all respondents, 60% felt they had to keep some opinions to themselves for fear of how they would be received. That included 75% of students who identified as strong Republicans and 63% of Blacks. But other surveys complicate that picture. So in 2020, the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA found that at least 8 of 10 students from each ideological group, left, liberal, middle of the road, conservative, either agreed or strongly agreed that their institutions encourage them to have a voice and to share ideas openly. Now, one of the things you should ask is what kind of what kinds of things differentiated these two groups. And because it does sound like there are things that are different. Perhaps they're asking the questions differently or they are reporting them differently. Perhaps they are sampling differently from the whole population. And so maybe we have some sort of biased sample in one or the other study. But we're going to focus here on applying causal criteria to correlations, something we've talked about so far. We have covariance, right? These two variables go together, although not consistently across studies. And so what we were talking about in terms of parsimony, and pattern, they don't nicely fit together in the ways that we'd like. It's not clear about temporal precedence, which variable came first. And internal reliability is not as clear here. Are there other things that are going on? So let's look at 3 studies on COVID transmission. And I want you to think about which one you trust most and why. So in this first one, researchers examined COVID infection rates in 233 school districts during the Delta outbreak based on whether the school district had strict masking requirements. After taking into account vaccination rates and SES, districts that had strict masking mandates had a 23% lower infection rate than schools with no or partial masking requirements. So if I were you, I'd turn off my video right now and think about what are the advantages and disadvantages here? What kind of study is this? What kinds of questions do you have here? In the second study, in a nursing home in Texas, the home's physician started giving the drug hydroxychloroquine to residents who tested positive for COVID-19. It's actually going well. People are getting better, the physician reported, although it's hard to quantify how much of the improvement is due to the drug. Again, what are your concerns? What kind of study is this? What other kinds of questions do you have about it? And finally, In Brazil, 1,300 patients who were sick with COVID-19 were randomly assigned to receive either ivermectin or placebo. Patients followed through illness or throughout illness with data collected on multiple indicators. They found no evidence of effectiveness of ivermectin for treatment of COVID-19. So stop and think about what's happening here. This first study, the Mueller study, we have a correlation. And because we have a correlation, we don't know about third variables. So it may be, that there are differences in other kinds of variables, that perhaps schools with masking mandates do a number of other kinds of things differently. Second one is a case study. And one of the things that would concern me is that there aren't any data here. We don't really know how they're quantifying what improvement is happening. And we certainly don't have a comparison group or a placebo group, which is what we see in the Zimmer research, where we have random assignment, where we have a placebo, presumably the patients and the researchers are blinded as to what condition they belong in. These are the kinds of things that a researcher is going to be asking as they're going through here, thinking about how do we make these kinds of decisions. So Mueller and Oppenheimer's research is one that is a study that we're going to talk about a fair amount over the next number of videos. This has been pretty influential in education, because their recommendation is that students should be taking notes longhand as opposed to on computer, and that they will learn more. And what you see here is that, these differences are pretty significant. And, particularly on conceptual questions as opposed to factual questions, that students do much better on when they are taking notes longhand as opposed to on a computer. Here's another study that we're going to talk about a fair amount. This is by Leonard et al. And again, this is the first page of the article. And so in this particular study, infants are observing an adult attempting to achieve a goal. Those children who see their parents persist for longer periods are more likely to persist themselves. Okay. And what you see is that those children, is exactly that those children who see parents making an effort are more likely to continue for longer periods. So we're going to be talking about independent and dependent variables. Independent variables are our manipulated variables. They are the levels, for example, effort versus no effort, laptop versus no laptop, or writing longhand. The dependent variable is our measured variable, our outcome variable. Things like persistence, how long is a child willing to work on a task? Um, like um, like the number of questions correct on an exam of factual and conceptual kinds of questions. And here you see generally that our independent variable is on the x-axis and our dependent variable is on our y-axis. And here is the data from Mueller and Oppenheimer. We also sometimes have control variables. So that's any variable that the experimenter holds constant. So for example, you might hold age of babies constant so that the babies may be between 12 and 14 months as opposed to 6 months or 36 months. Okay. And so we will stop here. And these are the basic ideas. We'll come back to them throughout this discussion. Take care.